Hi, it's Carol Salter here, reading chapter 12 of Witch on the Warpath. Tonight's chapter is called The Journey. It had taken Gristle a long time to calm down after the loss of so easy a picking in Hampstead. Many bizarre animals appeared and disappeared over the course of the next few hours. The witch managed to secure a replacement infant to complete her spell, but at great personal cost, and this had doubled, nay trebled, her ire and wrath, not to be confused with certain members of the Fairy Council. The Mile End Orphanage had increased its security fourfold since her previous incursions. It included near-fatal hexes and counterspells to such an extent that Gristle fancied she'd never be able to abduct another infant from the dratted establishment. She rubbed her left forearm, where several magic burns seared her skin. They'd be slow to heal, a side effect of the incineration spell she'd fallen foul of while stealing the cocooned infant away. "Blast them all to Nubis," she cursed, invoking one of the Neath realm gods and not giving a fig who heard her. One moment of pleasure might still be heard. She'd heard rumours that the blasted troll, and more importantly the fairy babe, was seen on the far side of the river, south of Bat's Roost. Gristle felt certain she was owed some recompense for her terrible injuries and downright inconvenience. Gristle wasn't the only one who heard about the troll and his fairy babe. A certain watcher called Hope, grieving over her first ever loss of a charge and concerned about her professional credibility, had heard the news too. Her colleagues continued to tell her the babe must have been eaten by a rampaging ogre, but she didn't believe them. When she heard reports of a troll demolishing the train station at Richmond, Hope knew the babe hadn't died. It made almost perfect sense. A troll had found the infant and decided not to eat it yet. She had time to save her infant and prove to the department she was a good watcher, good enough to be put back on active duty and not filing work as they'd been hinting. Hope was officially on holiday from the watching depot, a temporary leave of absence, her boss called it, so she could rest and come to terms with things. Hope never came to terms with anything. She always had hope. "I didn't put up with things in the orphanage when bullies hurt me, and I'm not about to start now. I knew my enchanted babe hadn't been eaten. She's enchanted. I enchanted her, and none of my enchantments fail, ever. I'm going to find my babe and see her to safety, regardless of what Mr. High and Mighty Earlybird thinks." Back in Richmond, Hearty and Onk were becoming friends of a sort. Hearty unravelled part of Onk's story, a tale of fortune and fear. He learnt that Onk had found and rescued the babe from what sounded like a horde of eagles, judging by the troll's reenactment. Then, the previous evening, while resting after dinner, Onk had been ordered to flee in fear for his life. It must have been a glamour of some kind, Hearty concluded, knowing that nothing and no one could ever frighten a troll. Leprechauns can do that. Maybe their concern was for the infant rather than you, Onk. After all, who would be daft enough to cross a fully grown troll otherwise? I don't know who might be after you or the babe. Either way, it isn't safe for either of you to remain in Richmond. Considering the route you took to get here, you're the talk of the Richmond clans. When Hearty suggested he take the fairy babe somewhere safe, Onk gave an emphatic no, shaking his shaggy head back and forth to reinforce his dissension. Hearty tried to explain again that the baby wasn't safe in Richmond, to which Onk replied, "Onk, go." It was a straightforward statement, leaving no room for debate or discussion. Onk rose and turned to leave Hearty. Panicking, Hearty spoke again without thinking. Wait! Wait! He realised Onk was serious in his decision to go. Onk stopped and looked up at the funny little green man perched on the lower branch of an alder tree. I'll come too, said Hearty, his voice confident and sure as he committed himself to an adventure without considering the consequences. Onk nodded his regal assent, and for some reason which Hearty couldn't put his finger on, he felt honoured to know the big man. They both agreed they had to leave the area to keep the baby safe from wagging tongues, who, Hearty suspected, would spread the word of their location. He needed to find a place to hide the babe and locate transport big enough to move and hide an adult city troll. The fairy part was easy. After much persuading, Hearty managed to get Onk to move the infant from the prominent position off the top of his hat and place her instead inside a hollow walnut shell he'd found. Onk suspended the closed shell from a leather shoelace around his neck after Hearty had fashioned a clever knotted arrangement to hold it steady. Onk was quite taken with his first piece of jewellery. He spent a long time admiring his reflection in the butcher's shop window, until the meat inside caught his attention more. Deciding that he'd like more items to hang round his neck, objects started appearing as they continued their journey. First a crow's foot, then a silver milk bottle top, followed by a piece of blue nylon rope. Onk adapted his wardrobe after discovering his first cat collar. These proved to be his favourite finds. The final ensemble gave Onk the appearance of some mighty shaman from a diverse religious sect. Hearty drew the line at the workman's red rubber glove suspended from Onk's waist. You have no idea how evil red rubber gloves are, do you? Onk shook his head, casting aside the glove as if it had the plague virus stuck to it. Hearty decided it was his job to educate Onk. I know just how evil and insidious rubber gloves are, he extolled, along with carrier bags placed in trees by mischievous imps to scare people cycling home after dark. Red rubber gloves are a firm favourite for infuriating humans. Go anywhere in Britain, and chances are, during your journey or at the end of it, you'll see one lonely red rubber glove in the road. These gloves aren't attractive. They're the type employed on building sites by misshapen-handed, low-waisted, park-your-bike construction workers. Together in pairs, they look less suspicious, but finding one glove alone is a much more sinister affair. Hearty was on a roll with his lecture on the danger of rubber gloves. He hadn't noticed Onk wandering off as he continued to spout his sermon on his favourite subject. Solitary gloves promote a deteriorating state of intellect. When someone spies one glove, they can't help but think obsessional thoughts. These thoughts alter the subconscious to an anorak level. Who has not thought, hello, there's a rubber glove on its own? The next second the glove has worked its hideous magic, and before you can say take me to your leader, you've fallen into the trap with the all-time classic follow-up thought, I wonder where the other one is. Who cares? No one. But it's started now. Your brain is trapped. The glove's evil plan causes the next drop in IQ. I wonder why they dropped it here. It's on a roll, and the cascade of deranged thoughts continues. They must have funny-shaped hands to wear that. How can they have not noticed dropping it? Now, at this point, the second level of mental inertia begins. This one rubber glove has people looking up and down the street. What do they expect to see? Some navvy with a rubber glove hanging out his back pocket, sobbing like a baby who's lost his rattle. The other glove thrown away in a fit of pique by a 22-stone bricklayer's mate, hopping along the road on its own. What humans don't know is these gloves are never left on public highways. Not by humans, anyway. You see, sensible British workmen adore their gloves. They leave them reposing in pairs in their mobile units, vans and lorries. Imps with nothing better to do are the culprits. They infiltrate places of employment, removing one red rubber glove because they know the chaos which ensues. It infuriates construction managers when their staff request one replacement rubber glove. You simply can't buy them singly. It's a clever business strategy by some rich rubber giant, who I reckon must be a caoutchouc pixie, extolled Harty finally. Harty finished his tirade with a flourish, pleased to be able to theorise that caoutchouc pixies were responsible for all of this chaos. Onk, however, was nowhere in sight, vanished in search of food a few minutes earlier. Onk, with his long hair and expanding jewellery collection, was fast becoming more noticeable rather than less, despite the babe being hidden inside a walnut shell along with his many other treasures. Folk impressed by Onk's appearance would dance up to him, touch him as if for a dare, and scamper away again smiling. It was like they'd had a blessing bestowed on them. In reality, the only luck they received was that they hadn't been eaten. Onk took their attentions in his stride, and it was a very big stride at that. Sometimes folks were taking their lives in their hands, especially the older ones. Onk's strolling pace was faster than most people's running away from a stampeding elephant's pace. Though Onk didn't speak much, he seemed to understand a great deal, judging by his non-verbal behaviour, which was how Harty extracted his story from him. Harty had given Onk's predicament a great deal of thought. He found the troll within a few short minutes by observing the glazed looks of the faces of fairy folk who'd encountered him. "I think I've come up with the practical solution," he said, shouting into Onk's left ear as he caught up, fluttering above and over Onk's shoulder. "I've a distant relative, a second cousin, living in Kent, called Stormy. Despite the fact we don't get on very well, I think you'd both be a lot safer living there than staying in London. At least till we can see the baby's safe. What do you think?" Harty settled on the top of a garden wall where Onk could see him better. Onk stopped and regarded the little man standing in front of him like a brave butterfly. He wasn't used to anybody talking to him, let alone nicely, and no one ever asked his opinion on anything, not even on trivial anythings. Onk decided he liked Harty. He smiled, and Harty interpreted that gesture as, "Okay. I know someone in the city who could help us get down into Kent unnoticed." Harty wasn't worried about humans seeing them, but other folk, creatures and birds could spot them easily. They needed to get Onk out of sight as soon as possible. On the 11th day following the babe's arrival on Earth, Harty and Onk left Richmond and headed across Ham Common, travelling east. Luckily, they missed Gristle's second abortive visit by a few hours. Gristle was, of course, livid. Furious doesn't come close to describe her fury. Calling down lightning, she annihilated every tree, bush and shrub for 100 yards, killing scores of wildlife and fairy folk. The London Fire and Rescue Service attended and put out a small forest fire started, they said, by a careless cigarette from an irresponsible dog walker. but it was actually Gristle, the witch, having a meltdown. Old Owl escaped death by the skin of his beak as Gristle incinerated his beloved oak tree within an inch of its life. All that remained of the beautiful 3 centuries-old specimen was the burnt-out husk and one withered arm pointing up to the sky in defiance. Owl was finishing a tasty meal of water voles, thanks to Hearty, in a nearby sycamore grove further upriver, on the opposite bank. When he returned, the poor bird was forced to find new lodgings upriver, but he couldn't find anything quite like his majestic old tree. Nothing saved Hearty's mulberry tree or its 12 companions. Nearby trees wept resin down their trunks at the loss of their friends and their symbiotic companions, some of whom refused to leave. The sudden explosion in the rabbit population was explained away by the men who knew as a result of the mild winter last year. These newcomers appeared fully mature in early autumn, which meant they couldn't possibly have been this year's offspring, no matter what the men who knew said. Gristle's emotions always got the better of her. She acted without thinking, time and time again. As a result, there was no one left alive in the area to question regarding the troll's whereabouts. Those that witnessed her rage survived by hiding in the shadows, trembling and fearful for their lives and out of her grasp. Gristle's lack of foresight made her even angrier when she realised what she'd done. She hated anyone to think she could be the slightest bit foolish. Hope the Watcher, on the other hand, was not foolish. If she had a problem locating her lost babe's exact whereabouts, she had no problem following Gristle's path of destruction. What did slow her down, however, was her very kind nature. She felt obliged to stop and assist a growing number of individuals caught up in Gristle's temper tantrums. Hope's concerns were beginning to escalate as she learnt that not only was the baby with a troll, but a witch was after her too. A troll could look after itself against a witch, but she worried about her infant caught in between two such aggressive species. Meanwhile, the pair of travellers, oblivious to their followers, were making their way east. Onk walked faster and covered more ground each step than Hearty did flying, so the elf accepted a lift. He could ride either on Onk's left shoulder or the brim of his eccentric hat. The hat smelt terrible, even from some distance away. An aura of Danish blue cheese hung about it. It made Hearty feel sick looking at it. He was sure a dog had died on it. The crown resembled a thin dog curled up asleep. Shoulder riding was risky business too, due to Onk's unconscious preening shrugs. Every so often he'd shake his long locks, not unlike women in shampoo and hair dye commercials. Sitting on his shoulder, Hearty was bombarded with long wavy hair undulating to and fro like fronds of thick, unwashed seaweed. Any more of it and he would insist Onk took a bath and washed his hair. To complement the hair waving and add into the unique experience of riding shoulder saddle, Hearty had to contend with Onk's footsteps. With each step he took, Onk's massive shoulders acted like piston engines, rising up and down in opposition to each other. This caused his plank-sized arms to swing back and forth in rhythm like gigantic pendulums. It was a walk of attitude, if Onk had known it. It said to the world, "Here I am. Look at me. I am king." In the human world, the only comparison was young men who walk so full of undisguised confidence that a strange bounce appears in their step. It's a bounce that lifts their body upwards into the air. Covent Garden's a good place to see this walk. Some women have it too, not quite a swagger, but not far off. It disappears in their 50s, replaced by a practical pace. The ladies of the troll world would have swooned over Onk if they'd seen him strutting his stuff now, looking like a troll-sized version of Heathcliff. Onk lumbered through the Weathering Heights long grasses of Ham Common and Richmond Park. They travelled first by way of Ilpie Island, home of Twickenham Rowing Club. The reason for the diversion was because Hearty needed to collect a few things for the journey, plus he wanted to say goodbye to Owl, who was stuffing his face full of vole in the small coppice north of the island. From there they journeyed on to Richmond Park, taking the direct route straight across the centre, past Pen Ponds, then on through the golf club next door and into Putney Vale Cemetery for their first night's rest on their trek down to Canterbury. It was Hearty's plan to avoid populated areas wherever possible, so folk wouldn't comment on their passing and spread the word. With this in mind, he encouraged Onk to keep to the shady wooded areas. Around London these were most numerous in cemeteries and parks. Hearty couldn't figure out Onk's dietary preferences. He'd seen the way Onk had dispatched the weasels to save the baby, and then later his distress when Hearty mentioned rabbits for tea. Maybe it was just rabbits, he thought. He felt assured Onk would have his fill of fat grey squirrels and birds within the cemeteries. Onk had very different ideas about his travelling menu. He voiced his immediate displeasure when Hearty voiced his idea by sniffing loudly and roaring an ear-numbing "No!" back at him. The thought of eating live meals regularly repulsed Onk. He only did it when there was no other option, in an emergency. His one-word reply was so thunderous, with so much outgoing breath, that Hearty flew backwards into a rubbish bin with the energy of a small gale. He emerged, coated in chocolate wrappers, orange peel and banana skins. Onk, feeling a bit guilty, picked the composting food off Hearty and ate it. Onk's action gave Hearty a new idea about feeding him. First he apologised to the troll, to which Onk nodded, and then he suggested, instead of dining on squirrels and birds, Onk could empty the cemetery bins and compost heaps every night they stopped. The local council workers arriving on their weekly pickup the next day were astonished. They discovered rubbish bins half full, and compost heaps vanished, as they unknowingly followed Onk's progress through the plots. The one exception being the dog bins, which were left untouched, for obvious reasons. Even trolls had limits. Putney Vale Cemetery opened in 1891. It covered 47 acres of parkland and was the first to suffer the vanishing compost pile treatment. "Well, I'll be blowed," muttered Fred Kennard in disbelief, as he and Albert Bailey unhooked their shovels from the side of the wagon to begin another day's toil for the authority. Their first job of the day was to clear the mountainous compost heaps which accrued over the weekend. "Will you look at this, Bert? Another of your bins is empty." Fred called to Albert from the near side of the wagon. Albert came round the far side of the aged depot vehicle to see what Fred was fussing over. "I reckon someone's doing our work for us," Albert said in an accusatory tone when he saw the empty bin. "I told you there's money in muck. Can't do much about it now. I don't suppose the old Bill would be interested." He continued looking around the metal bin for clues. "Means we can knock off early." Can't begrudge folk compost, can we? It's proper recycling, that's what that is, he concluded matter-of-factly. Fred, however, was aggrieved and felt something had to be done about it, for he was ever a man for doing things right. Yeah, I suppose you're right, nodded Fred in grudging agreement. But I thought it belonged to council once it's dropped in bin. True, true, replied the wise Albert, used to Fred's miserable disposition after working with him for 7 years. Then again, we can't go looking for culprits on account of having no clues, seeing as how it's all gone, now can we, Fred? Explained Albert, opening his hands wide to show how empty they were. Fred could see the logic of Albert's words and hands. There wasn't a leaf in sight, so no trail to follow. Besides, finishing early was always an asset in his eyes. He rubbed his stubbly chin thoughtfully. Still ain't right, Fred moaned, not being able to let it lie. Maybe, if we're lucky, all the bins will be empty and we'll have a day off, chuckled Albert. What do you think of that, Frederick Kennard? Albert suggested to his disgruntled mate, putting an arm round him in an effort to cheer him up. Was Fred's only reply. He didn't take kindly to folk moving his compost. In truth, he'd been hoping to put some compost on his dahlias at home. Fred didn't know it yet, but this was going to be a very lean week for his prize-winning dahlias. As Onk ate his compost supper in Putney Vale the night before, Hearty had floated around looking over the weed-covered graves and gravel avenues of forgotten people. He'd never taken much notice of human graveyards before. Fairies didn't have graves. When they died, their essence returned into the ether from which they came, vanishing in the twinkling of shiny fairy dust. Here and there a few graves within the rows were being cared for by devoted loved ones, their dedication evident in their humble gardening deeds. None of them would win prizes at Chelsea Flower Show, but these weren't tended out of pride, but out of love, and were more beautiful because of it. The newer memorials were readable and clean-faced, made of hardier stones than the earlier ones. Those of 100 years or more were crumbling into blank, moss-covered slabs. One day those antique stones would break or succumb to vandalism and be removed to line the graveyard walls like some amateur fortification. An aura of general neglect spread through the cemetery. Every invasive sycamore saplings sprouted unchecked out of many burial plots, tilting the gravestones enough to fall foul of the council's dreaded topple test. Decorations and ornaments tied to trees left by loved ones blew in the wind till over time they shredded themselves to pieces. Weeds grew everywhere. Dandelions, ivy, sticky bud and bindweed, not needing to compete for space, suffocated row after row of sad, lonely graves. The saddest part of any cemetery was the children's section. It was full of tiny, weather-damaged plastic toys, faded photos and heart-rending personal messages left by grieving parents and relatives. Though distressing, these weren't the worst thing to Hearty's mind. These young souls had people who cared about them. Gloomier still were those with no one to mourn their passing. Solitary graves, their occupants' names and ages lost to memory. Hearty, such a tender soul, landed on the grass in front of one and sobbed. Onk came over and stood near where Hearty sat, silent tears dropping down his cheeks. Despite not being able to read the stones, Onk could sense Hearty's unhappiness. His own emotions were evolving and emerging, and he too felt the grief in the air. His sense of empathy was developing since his exposure to the to Fim the young ghost, and he wanted to be there for Hearty should he need him. He nibbled on a month-old chrysanthemum stalk, collecting his thoughts, while Hearty regained his composure. The one area in each place kept clean, neat and manicured were the war graves. Soldiers, sailors and airmen's stones stood to attention in neat rows even after their death. The lawns around them were immaculately trimmed to military regulation height. These areas were maintained by local council employees and presided over by Her Majesty's Forces officials. At least, Hearty sniffed up at Onk, people remembered others who gave up their lives so future generations could live safer ones. Hearty promised Onk he wouldn't look at any more graves after he saw the forlorn expression Onk wore. It was far too sad and depressing, considering how quickly humans forgot their loved ones. Fairies were long-lived. When they eventually returned to the ether, their lives were celebrated decades after their deaths, despite the fact there was no plot of earth or urn containing their remains. Magic folk, it seemed, had better memories than humans. Hearty was fluttering along the last row of graves in the military section in Putney Vale when he spotted the smallest holly elf he'd ever seen. The elf in question was sitting shivering on the dry ground beneath his tree. That in itself was unusual, for all tree elves, without exception, always sat high up in their trees. They never, ever sat in the lowest branches, let alone on the ground. It was unthinkable and dangerous. I hope you enjoyed that. There was quite a bit there. I look forward to seeing you next time for chapter 13, Robin.